George Washington, February 22, 1732 – December 14, 1799, was an American military leader, statesman, and founding father of the United States. He served as the first President of the United States from 1789 to 1797. He had previously led the Patriots to victory in the Revolutionary War. He presided over the Constitutional Convention of 1787, which established the United States Constitution and the federal government. Washington is known as the Father of America for his leadership during the formative days of the new nation. Washington's first post was as Controller of Culpeper County, Virginia from 1749 to 1750. He then received military training and commanded the Virginia Regiment during the French and Indian War. He was later elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses and appointed a delegate to the Continental Congress, where he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. He commanded American forces, allied with France, during the defeat and surrender of the British at the Siege of Yorktown. He resigned his commission after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Washington played a key role in the passage and ratification of the Constitution and was twice elected president by the Electoral College. He created a strong, well-funded national government and remained impartial during the bitter rivalry between cabinet members Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. During the French Revolution, he declared a policy of neutrality while condemning the Jay Treaty. He set lasting precedents for the presidency, including the title, Mr. President, and his farewell address is widely considered a defining statement of republicanism. Washington owned slaves, and in order to maintain national unity, he supported measures passed by Congress to protect slavery. He later had trouble with the institution of slavery in his will of 1799. He attempted to assimilate Native Americans into Anglo-American culture, but resisted Native resistance in violent conflicts. He was a member of the Anglican Church and Freemasonry, and he promoted widespread religious freedom as president. After his death, he was honored as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. He is remembered in monuments, art, geographical locations including the national capital, state names, stamps, and currency as an American national hero, with many scholars and polls ranking him among the greatest presidents of the United States. The Washingtons were a family of Virginia planters who became wealthy through land speculation and tobacco farming. Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, immigrated to the Virginia colony in 1656 from Sulgrave, Northamptonshire, England. He amassed 5.000 acres, 2.000 hectares, of land in Virginia, including land around Little Hunting Creek, a tributary of the Potomac River. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Pope's Creek, Westmoreland County, then in the British colony of Virginia. He was the first of 6 children born to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. Augustine was a justice of the peace and a prominent public figure. He had previously married Jane Butler and had 4 children. In 1735, the Washington family moved to Little Hunting Creek. In 1738, they moved to Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, Virginia, on the Rappahannock River. When his father died in 1743, Washington inherited Ferry Farm and 10 slaves. His half-brother Lawrence inherited Little Hunting Creek and renamed it Mount Vernon. The death of his father deprived him of the opportunity to cross the Atlantic to receive an education at Appleby School in England as his older brothers had done. He attended school in Fredericksburg until the age of 15. His desire to join the Royal Navy was not realized after his mother learned that it would be difficult for him. Through Lawrence's connections with the powerful Fairfax family, at the age of 17, George became surveyor of Culpeper County in 1749. This well-paying job enabled him to purchase land in the Shenandoah Valley, the first of many land purchases in West Virginia. It was also through Lawrence's involvement with the Ohio Company, a land investment company financed by Virginia investors, and Lawrence's position as commander of the Virginia militia that George came to the attention of Virginia's new lieutenant governor, Robert Dinwiddie. Washington was hard to miss. At 6 feet 2 in 188 centimeters, estimates of his height vary, he towered over most of his contemporaries. In 1751, Washington traveled to Barbados with Lawrence, who was suffering from tuberculosis. In the hope that the climate would benefit Lawrence's health, Washington contracted smallpox on the trip, which left him with some scars on his face but made him immune to the disease later on. Lawrence's health did not improve, he returned to Mount Vernon, where he died in 1752. Lawrence's position as leader of the Virginia militia was divided into 4 positions after his death. Washington was appointed to one of the 4 new positions by Governor Dinwiddie in February 1753 with the rank of major in the Virginia militia. Washington also joined the Freemasons at Fredericksburg at that time. War against the Indians and the French, 1754 to 1758. Main article: George Washington in the French and Indian War. Washington's 1754 map showing the Ohio River and surrounding area. In 1753, the French began to expand their military control into the Ohio Country, a territory also claimed by the British colonies of Virginia and Pennsylvania. This dispute over sovereignty led to a war that the colonies called the French and Indian War from 1754 to 1762. This war helped start the global 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. Washington was at the center of this early conflict. The Ohio Company, a vehicle through which British investors planned to expand into the territory, was establishing new settlements and trading posts to trade with the Native Americans. Governor Dinwiddie was ordered by the British government to warn the French of British sovereignty there. He sent Major Washington in late 1753 to deliver a letter to the French informing them of British claims and demanding that they leave the territory. Washington also met with Tanacharison, also known as Half King, and other Iroquois leaders allied with Virginia at Logstown to gain their support in the event of a conflict with the French. Washington and Tanacharison became friends and allies. Washington delivered the letter to the local French commander, who politely refused to leave the territory. Governor Dinwiddie sent Washington back to the Ohio Country to protect a group of Ohio Company workers building a fort at what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But before he arrived, a French force drove the company workers out of the area and began construction on Fort Duquesne. A small group of French troops led by Joseph Coulon de Jumonville was discovered by Tanacharison and a few of his warriors east of what is now Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Together with his Mingo Indian allies, Washington and some of his local militia ambushed the French. What actually happened during and after the battle remains controversial, but the immediate aftermath was that Jumonville was mortally wounded in the initial attack and then killed, whether by a cold-blooded axe-wielding Tanacharison or by a gunman standing nearby as the wounded officer sat next to Washington. Neither of these are entirely clear. The French responded by attacking and capturing Washington at Fort Necessity in July 1754. Washington was, however, allowed to return to Virginia with his men. Historian Joseph Ellis concludes that the episode demonstrated Washington's courage, initiative, and eagerness to fight, but his lack of experience. These events had international consequences. The French accused Washington of assassinating Jumonville because they believed Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission. Both France and Britain were ready to go to war to compete for control of the region, and they sent troops to North America in 1755. War was officially declared in 1756. Braddock's disaster of 1755. In 1755, Washington served as the senior American aide to British General Edward Braddock on the ill-fated Monongahela expedition. This was the largest British expedition to the North American colonies, and was intended to drive the French from the Ohio Country. The French and their Native American allies ambushed and killed Braddock at the Battle of Monongahela. After suffering heavy losses, the British retreated in disarray. However, Washington rode around the battlefield to encourage and motivate the remaining British and Virginia militia to make an organized retreat. Commander of the Virginia Regiment. Peale, S. 1772 painting depicts Washington in the rank of Colonel of the Virginia Regiment. This is the oldest known portrait of Washington. Governor Dinwiddie promoted Washington in 1755 to Colonel of the Virginia Regiment and Commander-in-Chief of all the forces raised for the defense of His Majesty's colony, and charged him with the defense of the Virginia frontier. The Virginia Regiment was the first full-time American military unit in the colonies, in contrast to British regulars and part-time American militias. Washington was ordered to act in defense or counterattack whenever he thought it best, while in command of 1,000 soldiers. Washington was a disciplined officer who paid close attention to training. He led his troops in brutal campaigns against Native Americans in the West, in 10 months. His regimental units fought 20 battles, losing about a third of their number. Washington's enthusiastic war efforts meant that the frontier population of Virginia suffered less than that of the other colonies. Ellis concluded that this was his only unsung success in the war. In 1758, Washington participated in the Forbes expedition to capture Fort Duquesne. He was embarrassed by a misfire when his unit and a British unit mistook each other for French and opened fire. The incident resulted in 14 deaths and 26 injuries. Washington did not participate in any other major battles during the expedition. The British scored a major strategic victory by gaining control of the Ohio Valley when the French abandoned the fort. Following the expedition, Washington resigned from the Virginia Regiment in December 1758. He did not return to military life until the outbreak of the Revolution in 1775. Lessons learned. Although Washington never received the commission in the British Army that he desired, during those years of war, the young man accumulated valuable leadership, political, and military skills. He was always observant of British military tactics, grasping and understanding British weaknesses and strengths. This proved invaluable later in the American Revolution. He proved to be courageous and resilient in the most difficult situations, including accidents and retreats. He developed a command style that involved bringing all his strength, stamina, and courage to the battle. To his men, he appeared a natural commander and they obeyed him without question. Washington learned to organize, train, and discipline his regiments and companies through reading, observation, and conversations with career officers. He learned the basics of battlefield tactics as well as an understanding of organizational and logistical issues. He had a general understanding of strategy, especially the finding of strategic geographic locations. Historian Ron Chernow has suggested that because Washington was frustrated with dealing with government officials throughout the conflict, he came to favor the benefits of a strong national government with a strong bureaucracy to get results. Other historians tend to attribute this attitude toward government to his later Revolutionary War service. Note 1. He developed a very negative opinion of the value of militias, viewing them as unreliable, highly undisciplined, and of very short service when compared to regular troops. On the other hand, his command experience was limited to 1,000 soldiers at most and only in remote frontier terrain that was far removed from the urban situations he faced during the Revolution in the cities of Boston, New York, Trenton, and Philadelphia. Interwar period, at Mount Vernon, 1759 to 1774. A reprint of Martha Washington, based on a 1757 painting by artist John Wollaston. On January 6, 1759, Washington married a wealthy widow named Martha Dandridge Custis. Surviving letters suggest that he may have been in love with Sally Fairfax, the wife of a friend at the time. Nevertheless, George and Martha were a good match, as Martha was intelligent, charming, and experienced in running a slave-operated plantation. Together they raised her 2 children by her late husband, John Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis, affectionately known to their families as Jackie and Patsy. The Washingtons later adopted 2 of Mrs. Washington's grandchildren, Eleanor Parke Custis and George Washington Parke Custis. George and Martha Washington had no children together. His illness with smallpox in 1751 may have rendered him childless. Washington was too proud to admit that he was childless, but privately he felt depressed about his inability to have children. The newlyweds moved to Mount Vernon near Alexandria, where he lived the life of a planter and a political figure. Washington's marriage to Martha greatly increased his wealth and social status. He became one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. He received 1/3 of his wife's family's 18.000 acres, 73 square kilometers, of land upon their marriage, valued at about $100, and managed the remaining estate for Martha's children, whom he cared for sincerely. 49. He frequently purchased additional land and was also granted land in what is now West Virginia as a reward for his service in the French and Indian War. In 1775, Washington doubled the size of Mount Vernon to 6.500 acres, 26 square kilometers, and increased the number of slave laborers there to over 100. As a respected military hero and a major landowner, he held local office and was elected to the Virginia provincial legislature beginning in 1758. Washington expanded his home at Mount Vernon after his marriage. Washington led an aristocratic lifestyle. Fox hunting was a favorite pastime. He also enjoyed going to balls and parties. In addition to going to the theater, races, and cockfights, Washington was also known to play cards, backgammon, and billiards. Like most planters, he imported luxury goods and other goods from England and paid for them with exports of tobacco that he grew. Overspending and the unpredictability of the tobacco market meant that many Virginia planters of Washington's time lost money. Thomas Jefferson, for example, died heavily in debt. Washington began to save himself from debt by diversifying his business and paying more attention to his work. In 1766, he changed Mount Vernon's main profitable crop from tobacco to wheat. Wheat could be sold in America, and he started a variety of other businesses including a flour mill, fish farming, horse breeding, and weaving. Patsy Custis, his stepdaughter, died in 1773 of epilepsy, allowing Washington to pay off his British creditors. As half of Patsy's estate was transferred to him, a successful planter, he became a leader in Virginia's social elite. Between 1768 and 1775, he invited some 2,000 guests to his Mount Vernon estate, most of whom he considered people of rank. For those of lower social status, his advice was to treat them courteously, but keep them at a suitable distance. For as they grow more acquainted with you, you lose power over them. In 1769, he became politically active, introducing a bill in the Virginia legislature prohibiting the importation of goods from Great Britain. In 1754, Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie promised land to soldiers and officers who volunteered to serve in the French and Indian War. 57. Washington spent years trying to obtain the land promised to him and his soldiers. Governor Norborne Berkeley finally fulfilled his promise in 1769 to 1770. Washington received 23.200 acres near where the Kanawha River flows into the Ohio River in present-day West Virginia. American Revolution, 1775 to 1787. Main article: George Washington in the American Revolution. Although he opposed the Stamp Act of 1765, the first direct tax law imposed on the North American colonies, he did not take a leading role in growing colonial resistance until protests against the Townshend Acts, passed in 1767, became widespread. In May 1769, Washington introduced a proposal, drafted by his friend George Mason, calling for the Virginia colony to boycott British goods until the acts were repealed. 60. The British Parliament repealed the Townshend Acts in 1770. However, Washington viewed the passage of the Intolerable Acts of 1774 as an invasion of our rights and privileges. In July 1774, he presided over the session in which the Fairfax Resolutions were adopted, calling for the convening of a Continental Congress among other things. In August of that year, Washington attended the First Virginia Convention in which he was elected as a delegate representing Virginia to the First Continental Congress. Commander-in-Chief: Betsy Ross presenting the new American flag to George Washington, painting by Edward Percy Moran, 1917. After the battles of Lexington and Concord near Boston in April 1775, all the colonies were involved in the war. Washington appeared before the Second Continental Congress in military uniform, demonstrating that he was ready for war. 63. Washington had prestige, military experience, charisma, had been a military leader, and was known as a strong patriot. As the largest of the 13 colonies and located in the South, Virginia deserved recognition. New England, where the war had begun, felt that it needed the support of the South. Washington made it clear that he did not want to seek the position of commander, and he said that he was not worthy of the position, but no one really wanted it. 64. The Continental Congress established the Continental Army on June 14, 1775, nominated by John Adams of the Massachusetts colony. Washington was later appointed Major General and Commander-in-Chief. Washington played 3 roles in the war, in 1775 to 77, and again in 1781. He led his troops in combat against the main British forces. Although he lost many battles, he never ordered his troops to surrender during the entire war. He continued to fight the British relentlessly until the end of the war. Working with the Continental Congress, he planned the entire war strategy. Second, he organized and trained the army. He recruited regular troops and assigned General von Steuben, the German military expert, to train them. He did not take responsibility for the supplies that were always in short supply, but he did pressure Congress and the states to provide supplies. 66. Washington had a major say in the selection of the generals and in their basic strategy. 67. His achievements were mixed, as some of the men he selected were never good at command. He gradually found capable officers such as General Nathanael Greene, and his Chief of Staff Alexander Hamilton. The American officers never reached the level of their British opponents in tactics and warfare. They gradually lost most of their pitched battles. Major successes at Boston, 1776, Saratoga, 1777, and Yorktown, 1781, occurred when the revolutionaries lured the British away from their strongholds, making it easier to destroy them. Third and most important, Washington was the embodiment of armed resistance to the crown. He was the representative of the revolution. His great stature and political skill brought the Continental Congress, the army, the French, the militia, and the states together toward a common goal, by voluntarily resigning and discharging his army after the war was won. He established once and for all the principle of civilian supremacy in military affairs. And yet, he often repeated the view that well-disciplined professional soldiers were twice as good as undisciplined volunteers. Such professionals would help to dispel any suspicion of a standing army. 68. Victory in Boston. Washington assumed command of the Continental Army at Cambridge, Massachusetts in July 1775 during the Siege of Boston. Realizing that his army was running low on gunpowder, Washington requested new supplies. The Americans raided British gunpowder stores, some of which were in the Caribbean, and also attempted to manufacture some of their own. The Americans received nearly adequate supplies, about £2.5 million, by the end of 1776. Mostly from France. 69. Washington reorganized the army during the long siege, and forced the British to retreat with artillery placed on Dorchester Heights overlooking the city. The British withdrew from Boston in March 1776, and Washington moved his army to New York City. Although disdainful of most American patriots, the British press consistently praised Washington's personal qualities and character as a military commander. These articles were considered bold because Washington was a hostile general leading an army pursuing a goal that many British believed would destroy the British Empire. 70. Defeat at New York City and the Fabius Strategy. In August 1776, British General William Howe launched a major naval campaign aimed at capturing New York City. The Continental Army under Washington engaged the enemy for the first time as an army of the newly independent United States at the Battle of Long Island, the largest battle of the entire war. The Americans were greatly outnumbered by the British. Many American soldiers deserted, and Washington was defeated. Eventually, Washington was forced to retreat across the East River at night. He did so without loss of life or equipment. 71. Washington retreated north from the city to avoid being surrounded, allowing General Howe to attack and capture Fort Washington on January 16 with heavy casualties for the Continental Army. Washington then retreated across New Jersey. The future of the Continental Army was in doubt due to the expiration of enlistments and the series of defeats. 72. On the night of December 25, 1776, Washington returned to attack a Hessian outpost in western New Jersey. He led his army across the Delaware River to capture nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers at Trenton, New Jersey. Following his victory at Trenton, Washington scored another victory against British regulars at Princeton in early January. The British retreated back to New York City and its vicinity, where they remained until the Peace Treaty of 1783. Washington's victories undermined the British carrot and stick strategy of showing off force and then offering generous words. The Americans were determined to negotiate nothing less than independence. 73. These victories alone did not guarantee an ultimate Patriot victory. However, as many soldiers did not re-enlist or deserted during the harsh winter, Washington and Congress reorganized the army by increasing rewards for soldiers who remained in the army and also increasing penalties for those who deserted. This effectively increased troop numbers for the final battles. 74. Historians still debate whether Washington preferred the Fabian strategy, 75, of confusing the British with quick, sharp attacks and then withdrawing so that the larger British army could not catch him, or whether he preferred to fight large-scale battles. 76. While his southern commander Greene used Fabian tactics in 1780-81, Washington only used them in the fall of 1776 through the spring of 1777 after losing New York City and seeing much of his army disintegrate. The battles of Trenton and Princeton are two examples of Fabian tactics. However, by the summer of 1777, after Washington had regained his strength and confidence, he stopped using raids and prepared for large-scale confrontations, such as those at Brandywine, Germantown, Monmouth, and Yorktown. 77. Campaigns of 1777. In the late summer of 1777, British forces under John Burgoyne sent a large incursion south from Quebec, intending to cut off the rebellious New England. British General Howe in New York sent his corps south to Philadelphia instead of up the Hudson River to meet Burgoyne's army near Albany. This was a major strategic error for the British. Washington rushed to Philadelphia to engage Howe while closely monitoring the action in upstate New York. In close combat, which was too complex for his relatively inexperienced troops, Washington's forces were defeated at the Battle of Brandywine on September 11, 1777. Howe's tactics were superior to Washington's. As a result, Howe marched unopposed into the then American capital of Philadelphia on September 26. Washington's army unsuccessfully attacked the British garrison at Germantown in early October. While Burgoyne was out of Howe's reach, he was surrounded and forced to order the surrender of his entire corps at Saratoga, New York. 78. This was a major turning point both militarily and diplomatically. France responded to Burgoyne's defeat by entering the war, openly allying with the United States and turning the Revolutionary War into a major world war. Washington's loss of Philadelphia led some members of the U.S. Congress to discuss removing Washington from command. This effort failed after Washington's supporters rallied behind him. 79. Valley Forge. Main article. Valley Forge. Washington's 11,000-man army, 80, arrived for the winter at Valley Forge north of Philadelphia in December 1777. Over the course of 6 months, thousands died in the camp, mostly from disease. 81, with historians estimating the death toll to be between 2,000, 81, and 2,500, 82, 83, and even over 3,000 soldiers. 84, however, by spring, the army emerged from Valley Forge in good order, thanks in part to a massive training program led by Baron von Steuben, a veteran of the Prussian General Staff. The British withdrew from Philadelphia to New York in 1778. Watched by Washington, Washington then attacked them at Monmouth. The battle was inconclusive and one of the largest of the war. Eventually, the British continued toward New York, and Washington moved his troops away from New York. Victory at Yorktown. See also, Siege of Yorktown. In the summer of 1779, at Washington's direction, General John Sullivan launched a scorched earth campaign that destroyed at least 40 Iroquois villages throughout what is now central and upper New York. The Indians in the area were allies of the British. They often raided American settlements on the frontier. 85, in July 1780, 5,000 French veterans, led by General Donation de Rochambeau, arrived in Newport, Rhode Island to aid the American war effort. 86, with the financial support of about $20 in French gold for the Continental Army. Washington delivered the final blow against the British in 1781 after a French naval victory enabled French and American forces to besiege a British army in Virginia. The British surrender at Yorktown on October 17. 1781 marked the end of major hostilities on the North American continent. 87. John Trumbull's painting depicts Washington resigning as commander-in-chief. Disarm. Washington could not trust that after Yorktown the British would not resume hostilities against the Continental Army. The British still had some 26,000 troops occupying New York City, Charleston, and Savannah, along with a powerful fleet. The French army and navy had withdrawn, leaving the Americans to fend for themselves in 1782–83. The American treasury was empty, and unpaid soldiers were increasingly unruly, bordering on mutiny or potential coup. Washington helped prevent rebellion among his officers by intervening in what became known as the Newburgh Plot in March 1783. The result was a 5-year promise of bounties by Congress. 88. Under the Treaty of Paris, signed that September, Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States. Washington disbanded his army and on November 2nd, he delivered an eloquent farewell address to his troops. 89. On November 25th, the British evacuated New York City. Washington and the governor took over the city. On December 4th, at Fraunces Tavern, Washington formally bade farewell to his officers. And on December 23rd, 1783, he resigned as commander-in-chief. Historian Gordon Wood concludes that the greatest act of Washington's life was his resignation as commander-in-chief, an act that shocked the European aristocracy. 90. King George III called Washington the greatest man of his time for this act. 91. Constitutional Convention of 1787. Washington's retirement at Mount Vernon was short-lived. He made an expedition to the western frontier in 1784. 65, was persuaded to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, and was elected its president. He participated little in the debates, although he voted for and against various articles. But his high profile helped him maintain power in the convention and keep the delegates on their toes. The delegates had in mind the creation of the presidency for Washington, and they would allow him to define the office once he was elected. 92, after the convention, his support convinced many to vote for the Constitution. The new Constitution was ratified by all 13 states. 93, Presidency, 1789 to 1797. The Electoral College unanimously elected Washington as the first President of the United States in 1789. Note 2, and again in 1792. He is the only president to receive 100% of the electoral vote. Note 3, John Adams, who received the next highest number of votes, was elected vice president. At his inauguration, Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States on April 30th. 1789, at Federal Hall in New York City. The United States Congress first voted to pay Washington a salary of $25 a year, a large sum in 1789. Washington, already wealthy at the time, refused the salary because he valued his image as a selfless public servant. However, he later accepted the salary when urged by Congress to avoid setting a precedent that the presidency was limited to independently wealthy individuals who could serve without compensation. 95, recognizing that everything he did would set a precedent, Washington was careful to treat his inauguration with formality. He wanted to make sure that the title and regalia were Republican and never European feudal. In the end, he preferred the title, Mr. President, to more formal titles. 96. Washington proved to be a talented government leader, an outstanding representative, a brilliant judge and a personable person. Washington spoke frequently with department heads and listened to their advice before making final decisions. 97. In handling the day-to-day affairs of government, he was systematic, orderly, zealous, always seeking the opinions of others but decisive. 98. Washington reluctantly served a second term. He refused to run for a third term, setting the precedent that presidents serve a maximum of 2 terms. Domestic issues. Washington did not belong to any political party and hoped that political parties would not be formed for fear that partisan conflict would destroy republicanism. 99. His closest advisors formed 2 factions, which laid the framework for the future first party system. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton had bold plans to establish a national credit system and build a financially strong nation. And he also laid the foundation for the Federalist Party. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, founder of the Jeffersonian Republican Party, repeatedly opposed Hamilton's agenda, but Washington generally favored Hamilton over Jefferson. As a result, Hamilton's agenda became effective. 100. The Residence Act of 1790, signed by Washington, authorized the President of the United States to select a specific location for the permanent seat of government. The location was to be along the Potomac River. The act authorized the President to appoint 3 commissioners to inspect and seek to acquire land for the capital. Washington personally oversaw this effort throughout his tenure in office. In 1791, the commissioners named the permanent capital, the city of Washington in the Territory of Columbia, in Washington's honor. In 1800, the Territory of Columbia became the District of Columbia when the federal government moved to a suitable location under the terms of the Residence Act. 101. In 1791, Congress imposed an excise tax on liquor, which sparked protests in the frontier regions, especially in Pennsylvania. In 1794, after Washington ordered the protesters to appear before a U.S. district court, the protests turned into widespread defiance of the federal government, known as the Whiskey Rebellion. The federal army was too small to be of any use, so Washington invoked the Military Act of 1792 to call in local militia from Pennsylvania, Virginia, and several other states. The governors sent troops. Washington assumed command and sent troops into the rebel areas. The rebels dispersed and there was no conflict, as Washington's bold actions demonstrated that the new government could defend itself. These events marked the first time under the new Constitution that the federal government used strong military force to enforce its authority over the states and their citizens. 102. Diplomatic. In 1791, shortly after the outbreak of the Haitian Revolution, at the request of the French, the Washington government agreed to send money, arms, and other supplies to the French colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, to help the bewildered colonists. This aid was part of the repayment of debts owed by the United States during the Revolutionary War, which eventually amounted to about $400, 103. In the spring of 1793, a major war broke out between conservative Britain and its allies against revolutionary France, initiating an era of war that would spread throughout Europe until 1815. With the approval of his cabinet, Washington declared American neutrality. The French revolutionary government sent diplomat Edmond Charles Genet, known as Citizen Genet, to America. Genet was warmly welcomed in America. He advocated for the French side in the war between France and Britain. To this end, he helped promote the development of a system of democratic societies in major cities. He issued letters of attack from the French government to French ships manned by American crews so that they could attack and seize British merchant ships. This angered Washington, who demanded that the French government recall Genet. Washington also denounced the democratic societies. 104. Hamilton and Washington drafted the Jay Treaty to normalize trade relations with Britain, requiring them to withdraw from Western forts and settle financial debts left over from the Revolution. 105. John Jay negotiated the treaty and signed it on November 19. 1794. Jefferson's faction supported France and strongly criticized the treaty. Washington's strong support mobilized the public and proved decisive when the treaty passed the Senate with the necessary two-thirds majority. 106. The British agreed to abandon their forts around the Great Lakes. The United States-Canada border was re-established. Numerous pre-revolutionary debts were paid, and the British opened their West Indies colonies to American trade. Most importantly, the treaty helped put an end to the war with Britain and usher in a decade of prosperous trade with Britain. The treaty angered the French and became a central issue in many political controversies. 107. Farewell Speech. Washington's Farewell Address. Washington's farewell address, published in the form of a public letter in 1796, is one of the most influential statements of republicanism. It was largely written by Washington himself, with the help of Hamilton. It spoke of the need and importance of national unity, the value of the United States Constitution and the rule of law, the evils of political parties, and the virtues of Republican citizenship. He called virtue a necessary engine of popular government. 108. Washington's public political address warned against foreign influence in domestic affairs and American interference in European affairs. He warned against partisanship in domestic politics and called for people to rise above party affiliation and serve the common good. He warned against permanent alliances with any part of the world abroad. 109. He said that the United States must focus primarily on American interests. He advised the United States to befriend and trade with all nations, but warned against American intervention in European wars or entering into long-term, entangling alliances. The speech quickly established American values regarding foreign affairs. 110. Retirement, 1797 to 1799. Painting of George Washington, by Gilbert Stuart in 1797. After his presidency ended and he retired in March 1797. Washington returned to Mount Vernon feeling very comfortable. He devoted much of his time to his farm and various businesses, including his distillery, which produced its first batch of wine in February 1797. 111, as Chernow, 2010, explains. His farming operations were very profitable. The lands further west on the frontier were less profitable because they were often attacked by Native Americans and the settlers who lived there refused to pay him rent. However, most Americans assumed that he was very wealthy because of the aura of prosperity and grandeur that his Mount Vernon farm was known for. 112. Historians estimate his fortune to be worth about $1 million in $1799, equivalent to about $18 million in 2009 dollars. 113. On July 4, 1798, Washington was commissioned by President John Adams as Lieutenant General and Commander-in-Chief of all Army Corps that had been or would be raised for a possible war with France. He served as senior officer of the United States Army between July 13, 1798 and December 14, 1799. He participated in planning a provisional army to meet any contingencies that might arise, but did not see action. His second in command, Hamilton, was in direct command of the army. 114, passed away on Thursday, December 12, 1799. Washington spent several hours on horseback inspecting his farm, which had been hit by snow, hail, and freezing rain by evening. He sat down to dinner without changing his wet clothes. On Friday morning, he awoke with a severe sore throat, perhaps acute pharyngitis or laryngitis, and felt increasingly hoarse as the day progressed. At about 3 a.m. on Saturday, he woke his wife and said he felt sick. His illness worsened until he died at home around 10 p.m. on Saturday, December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. His last words were, "'Tis well. I died painfully, but I am not afraid." 115, 116. Around the world, people were saddened by Washington's death. Napoleon ordered 10 days of mourning throughout France. In the United States, thousands of people wore mourning clothes for months. 117. To protect their privacy, Martha Washington burned all of their letters to each other after his death. Only 3 letters between the two survive to this day. Washington's grave at Mount Vernon, Virginia, on December 18, 1799. The funeral was held at Mount Vernon. He was buried there. 118. With the support of his wife, the United States Congress passed a joint resolution to erect a marble monument in the United States Capitol to house his body. In December 1800, the United States House of Representatives introduced a bill allocating approximately $200 to build a pyramid-shaped mausoleum with a base measuring 100 square feet, 30 square meters. Southern opposition to the project defeated the bill, as Southerners felt it would be best to leave his body at Mount Vernon. He was from Virginia, a southern state at the time. 119. In 1831, to commemorate his 100th birthday, a new tomb was built for him. That year, a plot to steal his body was made but proved unsuccessful. 120. Nevertheless, a joint congressional committee, a committee of both houses of the legislature, in early 1832 discussed removing Washington's body from Mount Vernon and placing it in a crypt in the Capitol building built by Charles Bulfinch in the 1820s. Again, opposition from the South proved fierce. Given the growing animosity between the North and the South, Representative Wiley Thompson of Georgia expressed Southern fears when he said, "Take the remains of our beloved Washington away from the remains of his relatives and ancestors from Mount Vernon and away from his home state to place in this capital. And then if there should come a dissolution of this union, then behold the remains of Washington will lie on a shore foreign to his native soil." 121. This ended discussions about moving his remains, and he was placed in a newly constructed tomb there on October 7, 1837, with John Struthers of Philadelphia officiating. 122. After the ceremony, the inner crypt was closed and the key to the tomb was thrown into the Potomac River. 123. Heritage. Congressman Henry "Lighthorse Harry" Lee, a fellow soldier of his during the American Revolutionary War, was famous for his praise of Washington. 124. First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his people, he was a man of unsurpassed humility and personal experience. Courtesy, justice, humanity, moderation, and sincerity, consistent, dignified, and majestic, his example seemed to illuminate all around him, and the effects of his example everlasting. Throughout them, evil trembled at his presence, and beauty felt his helping hand. His purity of character illuminated his public virtue. Such was he, the man our nation mourns. William Safire, ed. Lend Me Your Ears. Great Speeches in History, 2004, page 185. James Sharple's 1751 portrait of Washington was used on a stamp issued in 1908. 125, 126. Lee's eulogy set the standard by which Washington's extraordinary reputation would be imprinted in the American memory. Washington set many precedents for the national government, and especially for the presidency. He was called the "Father of the Nation," beginning in 1778. 127, 128, 129. Washington's birthday, celebrated on President's Day, is a federal holiday in the United States. 130. During the American Bicentennial year, George Washington was promoted to the rank of General of the Armies by a joint resolution of the United States Congress, see Public Law 94-479. Passed on January 19, 1976, effective July 4, 1976, 65. This action elevated Washington to the rank of the highest-ranking military officer in United States history. Cherry Tree. Vague stories about Washington's childhood include that he swiped a silver dollar across the Potomac River at Mount Vernon and that he cut down his father's cherry tree. Admitting to the act when questioned, "I can't tell a lie. Daddy." This anecdote was first reported by biographer Parson Weems, who interviewed people who knew Washington as a child. Weems' version of the story was widely published throughout the 19th century, such as in McGuffey Readers. Moralistic adults wanted children to learn moral lessons from history, especially from great national heroes like Washington. After 1890, however, historians used scientific methods to corroborate each story, and they found no evidence for Weems's account. In 1904, Joseph Rodman noted that Weems had plagiarized other stories about Washington from novels published in England. No alternative source for the cherry tree story has been found. But Weems' credibility is questionable. 131, 132. Commemorative stamps. George Washington's image appears on United States currency, including the $1 bill and the quarter. Washington's image has appeared on numerous United States postage stamps and in many different varieties. He appeared on one of the first stamps issued by the United States Postal Service in 1847. Along with Benjamin Franklin, 125, beginning in 1908. The United States Postal Service issued the longest-running series of postage stamps in the history of the United States Postal Service when it issued the Washington Franklin series. This was a series of over 250 stamps featuring Washington and Franklin. Washington's image has appeared on more United States postage stamps than all other famous Americans combined, including Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Franklin. 125. Washington, issued in 1862. 24 cents. Washington, issued in 1895. 2 cents. Washington Franklin 1917 5 cent stamp set. Washington Franklin 1917 7 cent stamp set. Washington praying at Valley Forge, 1928. 2 cent. Monuments and memorials. George Washington Masonic Memorial, Alexandria, Virginia. Soon after the victory in the American Revolution, there were many proposals to build a monument to Washington. After his death, the United States Congress ordered the construction of a suitable memorial in the nation's capital. But this decision was reversed when the Republicans took control of Congress in 1801. Republicans were dismayed that Washington had become a symbol of the Federalist Party. Moreover, Republican values seemed incompatible with the idea of erecting monuments to powerful men. 133. Political squabbles and the North-South divide during the American Civil War prevented the completion of the Washington Monument until the late 19th century. By then, Washington was considered a national hero revered by both the North and the South, and his monuments were no longer controversial. 134. Before the obelisk that stood on the National Mall several decades earlier, the citizens of Boonesboro, Maryland built the first public monument to Washington in 1827. 135. Today, Washington's likeness and face are often used as national symbols of the United States. 136. His image appears on modern currency including the $1 bill and the quarter, and on United States postage stamps, in addition to appearing on the first postage stamps issued by the United States Postal Service in 1847. 125. Washington, along with Theodore Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, and Lincoln, is depicted on Mount Rushmore. The Washington Monument, one of the most famous landmarks in the United States, was built in his honor. The George Washington Masonic National Monument in Alexandria, Virginia was built between 1922 and 1932 with voluntary contributions from all 52 local governing bodies of Freemasonry in the United States. 137, 138. Equestrian statue, 1860 by sculptor Clark Mills. Located in Washington Circle in Washington, D.C. Many places and entities have been named Washington in his honor. Washington became the name of the national capital, Washington, D.C., one of two national capitals in the world to be named after a U.S. president, the other being Liberia's capital. Monrovia, Washington State is the only state to be named after a U.S. president. 139. George Washington University and Washington University in St. Louis are named after him, as is Washington and Lee University, which was renamed Washington Academy when Washington donated a large sum of money to the school in 1796. Washington University in Chestertown, Maryland, established by Maryland's state charter in 1782, was supported by Washington during his lifetime by donating 50 British gold pieces, 140, and serving on its board of visitors and governors until 1789, when Washington was elected president. 141. Countless American cities and towns have a street named after Washington. The Confederate state seal prominently features George Washington on horseback. 142. In a similar pose to a stone statue of him in Richmond, Virginia. 143. London has a bronze statue of Washington, one of 22 identical bronze casts, based on the original marble statue sculpted by Jean-Antoine Hoden and placed in the rotunda of the state capitol in Richmond, Virginia. The replica was presented to the British by the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1921. It stands in front of the National Gallery, London, in Trafalgar Square. 144. Writings and documents of George Washington. The formal collection and publication of Washington's writings and documents began with Jared Sparks' pioneering work in the 1830s. Life and Writings of George Washington, 12 volumes. Published 1834 to 1837. The Writings of George Washington from the original manuscript sources, 1745 to 1799, 1931 to 44, is a 37-volume collection edited by John C. Fitzpatrick. The collection includes over 17,000 letters and documents and can be found here archived February 18, 2011 at the Wayback Machine. The final all-text edition, without images, was published by the University of Virginia in 1968. And to date there have been 52 copies published with more to come. This collection includes everything Washington wrote or signed, along with much of the correspondence he received. A portion of the collection is available here. Personal life. Along with his wife Martha's immediate family, mentioned above, George Washington had a close relationship with his nephew and heir Bushrod Washington, the son of his brother John Augustine Washington. After his uncle's death, Bushrod became a justice of the United States Supreme Court. However, George Washington's relationship with his mother, Mary Ball Washington, was apparently somewhat difficult and strained. 145. As a young man, Washington had red hair. 146. 147. There is a popular legend that he wore a wig as was fashionable at the time. In truth, Washington did not wear a wig, instead he powdered his hair. 148. 149. As seen in several paintings including a famous but unfinished one by Gilbert Stuart. 150. Washington suffered from his teeth throughout his life. He lost his first adult tooth when he was 22 and had only one remaining when he became president. 151. John Adams claimed that Washington lost his teeth by using them to crack Brazil nuts. But modern historians believe that the mercury dioxide he drank to treat diseases such as smallpox and malaria may have contributed to his tooth loss. He had several sets of dentures made, 4 of which were made by a dentist named John Greenwood. 151. Contrary to popular belief, these dentures were not made of wood. The set made for him when he became president was made of ivory and hippopotamus ivory, held in place by gold bands. 152. Washington's dental problems caused him frequent toothaches, which he resorted to using tinctures of opium. 153. His pain from toothache can be clearly seen in many of the portraits he drew while he was still in office. 153, including the one used on the US $1 bill. 150. Note 4. The slave problem. After his father's death in 1743, 11-year-old George Washington inherited 10 slaves. By the time he married Martha Custis in 1759, he personally owned at least 36 slaves. His wife inherited and brought to Mount Vernon some of her late husband's slaves, at least 85 of whom she had previously owned. He used her wealth to buy more land, tripling the size of the plantation, and adding more slaves to work it. In 1774, he paid taxes on 135 slaves, not counting his wife's slaves inherited from her late first husband. His last slave purchase was in 1772, although he later took in some slaves to pay off debts. 154. Washington also used white immigrants as domestic servants to pay off his immigration debts. In April 1775, he paid a bounty to get back 2 white servants after they ran away. 155. One historian claims that Washington desired the material benefits of slave ownership and wanted his wife's family to have a prosperous inheritance. 156. Before the American Revolution, Washington had no moral objections to slavery, but in 1786, Washington wrote to Robert Morris that, "No one desires more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." 157. In 1778, he wrote to his manager at Mount Vernon that he wanted to get rid of the Negroes. Maintaining a large and aging slave population at Mount Vernon was not economically beneficial. However, Washington could not legally sell his wife's dower slaves, and because these slaves had intermarried with his own slaves, he could not sell his own slaves either, on the grounds that if he sold his slaves, he would indirectly cause their families to break up. 158. While president, Washington brought 7 slaves to New York City in 1789 to serve as the first presidential servants. After the nation's capital moved to Philadelphia in 1790, he brought 9 slaves to work in the presidential palace. At his death, there were 317 slaves working at Mount Vernon, of whom Washington owned 123. 154 were inherited slaves of his wife, and 40 were hired by a neighbor. 159. Dorothy Tuig suggests that Washington did not speak out publicly against slavery because he did not want to create a rift in the newly formed republic over a highly sensitive and divisive issue at the time. 160. Religion. Main article, George Washington and Religion. Washington kneeling in prayer. Stained glass window in the Congressional Chapel, Capitol Building. Washington was a member of the Anglican Church, later known as the Episcopal Church, in established standing in Virginia, meaning that taxes were used to pay church officials. He was a serving member of the Board of Christ Church in Alexandria, Virginia, and Poig Church near his home on the Mount Vernon plantation until the war began. However, the parish was a unit of local government and was largely concerned with civic affairs such as roads and poverty alleviation. 161. According to historian Paul F. Bowler Jr., Washington was in fact a naturalist, with a deep belief in divine providence, or divine providence, originating from a supreme being controlling human events and, as in Calvinist theology, the course of history follows an orderly pattern rather than mere chance. 162. 163. In 1789, Washington declared that the universal creator had actively intervened in the American Revolution. However, according to Bowler, Washington never sought to personalize his own religious views or express any fondness for the virtues of biblical passages. Bowler argues that Washington's religious allusions were entirely lacking in emotional depth. 164. Philosophically, he was fascinated and chose the Stoic philosophy of ancient Rome. This philosophy values virtue and humanity and can be compared with natural theism. 165. In a letter to George Mason in 1785, Washington wrote that he was not among those alarmed by a law making men pay for the support of the religion they profess, but felt it unwise to pass such a law, and wished that it had never been proposed because he believed it would disturb the peace of public life. 166. Washington often accompanied his wife to church. However, there is no record of him receiving communion. He often left church before receiving communion, along with others who did not. After being reprimanded by a minister, he stopped attending Sunday services. 167. As president, he was encouraged by being seen attending services at numerous churches, including Presbyterian, Quaker, and Catholic, demonstrating his general support for religion. 168. Washington was known for his generosity. He attended many charitable events and donated money to schools, universities, and the poor. As a leading citizen of Philadelphia, President Washington spearheaded the provision of charity to widows and orphans in the capital city during a yellow fever epidemic in 1793. 169. Michael Novak and Jana Novak suggest that it may have been Washington's intention to maintain a deliberate ambiguity and personal privacy regarding his innermost religious convictions, so that every American, both then and ever since, might feel free to approach him on his own terms, and might feel himself a full member of the new republic. equal to all others. 170, they conclude. He was raised in the Episcopal Church to which he always belonged, and my opinion is that he believed in the fundamental tenets of Christianity as taught in the Church, as he understood it, but there was no intolerance or disrespect for the beliefs and practices of Christians of other denominations. 171. Freemason. In 1752 Washington was admitted to Freemasonry. 172. At his 1789 presidential inauguration, the Grand Master of the New York chapter administered the oath of office to him. On September 18, 1793, he laid the cornerstone of the United States Capitol bearing the Grand Master's seal. Washington had a high regard for the order's bylaws and often praised them, but he rarely attended chapter meetings. He was attracted by the movement's devotion to Enlightenment principles. American chapters did not share the anti-clerical outlook that had brought disrepute to European chapters. 173. Family and homeland. George Washington was born in Virginia and was the first child of Augustine Washington, 1694 to 1743, and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington, 1708 to 1789. Before marrying Mary Ball, Augustine had 4 children with his first wife, Jane Butler, 2 of whom died in infancy, Lawrence and Jane, and the first child, Butler, who died in infancy. Augustine and Mary Ball had 6 children together, the youngest of whom died at the age of 1 due to premature birth. Thus, George Washington had 4 half-siblings and 5 full siblings.